Okay. Good afternoon, and welcome to the last panel or roundtable titled Law and Gender in Ottoman Historiography, two themes that I assume this audience know their centrality to Leslie's work. We have three speakers. The format will be each speaker will have anything between 10 to 20 minutes. We'll start with Omar Shetta of Bard College, then Irfana Hashmi of Whittier College, and then Cecilia Maz of Cornell, and as of the spring, Franklin Marshall. Some of the speakers will stay here, some will... Okay, so it will be nominally a round table without the table component. And then after the thing, we'll just open the floor for questions. Omar.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so maybe there's something kind of different than many of the speakers and kind of Leslie's students who spoke earlier, is that what I worked on and the kind of Leslie's influence on my understanding and studying of history is mostly actually not about gender. It's more about microhistory and about law. And so when Ayelet contacted me about this conference and said that this kind of the theme is about gender and law, I was kind of this is going to be a bit challenging for me because what am I going to do now? And I went through some of the cases, court cases from the 19th century that I had worked with and continue to kind of read and try to interpret. And I'm thinking that to do something meaningful with gender, kind of since gender is not a central category in what I do, I want to find gender as a relation, right? Kind of a not just as kind of looking for instances in which women are doing things which men and women do. And so as I was going through some cases. And trying to decide on something to kind of contribute in this roundtable to start the conversation, I found this short entry from 1874, Cairo, 1874, a case that is commercial and in the commercial court in Cairo, the merchant court in Cairo. And the reason why I think it's significant is that at this point there was a clear distinction between, or this is what the court was trying to do, is distinguish between disputes over money that were commercial and disputes over money that were within the family realm, so inheritance and so on. And this case is interesting because it actually mixes both and is categorized as a commercial dispute, but it is about a family relationship. Even though the entry is short, it refers to other things that are only mentioned briefly. And so it took me I had to read it more than once to reconstruct the timeline. So very simply, here is the case. Initially, something that is kind of related to the dispute, but is not the dispute yet, is that a guy called Abd Samad dies in 1867. And he has two sons. One is old enough, he's kind of reached the age of legal majority, and the other one is a legal minor. And so the older son, Hassan, inherits his part of the father's estate, but also becomes a guardian for his younger brother, Hussein. So he's in charge of all of the money, but not all of it is his own. And then he takes all of the money, his money and his brother's money, which is supposed to be only preserving for the brother, and invests it in a commercial venture, and then loses money. So he loses his brother's money. This is where it gets interesting. Once he loses money, declares bankruptcy, he's insolvent, the merchant court in Dumyat, basically, where they are, in Damietta, decides to, as it does, is basically to liquidate his assets, because this is the way that they can pay the creditors, even a share of what they already owed. And in doing so, he loses, finally now, his brother's money. The only way for the money to be recovered, or the way that ends up kind of the pursuit of recovering the brother's money, happens through a very interesting family dynamic, which is that the mother, Zuleika, sues her older son, Hassan, and says, you have wasted your brother's money, and also appeals against the court's decision and says, this is not regular investment money, this is inheritance money and should have been protected. It should have been paid back before the liquidation of the assets. Now, the document that I see is not in Damietta. It refers to these events, but it's happening in Cairo. And the Cairo Merchant Court is acting as a court of appeals, a court of second instance. And what the court, there are a few features of the case that I think are significant. First, that even though the mother sues the son before the Court of Appeals, she never goes to court. Her agent, her legal agent, her wakil, doesn't go to court either, and the son, the defendant, doesn't go to court. No one goes to court. The court basically receives the request, has the papers, and then says, well, no one showed up, so we're going to examine the papers. They examine the papers and they decide, it's true, this is inheritance money, and we should get it out of the money that is kind of belongs to that is now under the control of the bankruptcy trustee, and pay it to the younger son, or preserve it in the governorate in Damietta for the younger son and until he reaches the age of majority. And in doing so, it recognizes this money as mal al-yatim. It's money that belongs to an orphan. But then it charges Hassan, the older son who lost the money, the court fees, which is a fraction. So the money that he had lost is 100 Egyptian pounds. The court fees is £1 and a fraction, so less than 2% of the total. So in reading this, and basically inspired by, this is a fragment, as you see, and it's not a case that I know that comes before or after in the register. I don't have access to the register of the court in Damietta, but I am, and this is why I say I'm kind of really influenced by what Leslie did in Morality Tales in terms of kind of looking very closely at these kind of cases in context, but also trying to read them imaginatively. So trying to look at each one of those details and try to kind of zoom out and understand why are those happening. So just by way of introducing the case, I would say 4 things about the case that I noticed and then possible interpretations for why they're happening. The first is, why did they not go to court? Why did no one go to court? And one thing that one possible interpretation is that maybe this was a family strategy, maybe not a very common one, but maybe this was a way in which both the mother and the son, who's the older brother, decided is a way to recover this money that was not intended to be lost in the first place, and that there's no actual dispute in the family that is being resolved in court. The other thing is the fact that only the mother has a legal representative. This is happening in the 1874. It had become very common, and I know this from kind of my other research, that most people, when they go to the merchant court in the 1870s, have legal representatives, a lawyer or an attorney, someone to represent them and to speak the legal language that the court wants. But there's only one person mentioned here, and he doesn't even go to make a case. He basically writes the request, writes the kind of the appeal that is going to court. And this kind of, to my mind, maybe confirms the idea that this is kind of the family moving as a unit here, or the mother and the son are moving as a unit here. And then there are 2 things that I don't have good answers for, but I want to raise them. Maybe we'll talk about them during the discussion, which is that in cases, in looking at court cases or social disputes in general that seem to be counterintuitive, we sometimes quickly choose between one of 2 things, or we kind of say that there are 1 or 2 scenarios and we opt for one of them. It's to say, well, either this is arbitrary, or to say this is rational, there must be something behind it. This is why it's happening in this way. And oftentimes we really struggle to find what's the rationale behind a particular sequence of events. But there are a couple of things about the case here that I think could be moments in which we see things actually not working as they should, and not for a good reason, or for a reason that's maybe not, I mean, I wouldn't say irrational, but at least there's no kind of good strategy behind it. It's an actual failure in the work of bureaucracy, an imperfection in the work of bureaucracy, not a strategic move. The first is, and I kind of withheld both of those details when I presented the case initially, is that the time period between Hassan going bankrupt, becoming insolvent, and the resolution of the case is 5 years, which is a very long time. And the legal action does not follow the legal action is not happening, I mean, it's happening in order, but it's also not happening immediately after these events are happening. So something would happen, and then a year later, the court would hear it. So this probably has to do with the capacity of the court in processing these the requests that are coming to the cases that are presented to the court. But at the same time, the situation is changing rapidly. So to say that money will be given by the bankruptcy trustee to someone who had lost it 5 years ago, well, by that point, probably all of the money had been liquidated and distributed to creditors. So how is it going to be claimed? Or is this just some kind of theoretical kind of position where it says, well, you owe this money, but because of the way the court works, you're not going to actually get it, but you're going to have a legal claim to it. And the other thing, which I find more puzzling and less typical than this kind of backlog of cases, is that the merchant court in Cairo, whoever is presiding over it then, because those people rotate every 6 months or so, is not aware. They make a very strange statement. They say, okay, we've heard this case, we've decided on it, and we are considering ourselves a court of appeals to the decision made in Damietta, but we actually did not know that there was a merchant court in Damietta. The word they use is لا علم لهذا الطرف. So this party does not have knowledge that there is a merchant court in Damietta. They knew that they acted as a court of appeals to the merchant court in Alexandria. But for some reason, they kind of the board of merchants presiding over the court did not basically expect to get a case from Damietta, and there's something in this kind of admission of a lack of knowledge and saying we'll do this since we do it for other courts, and since you gave us a piece of paper that actually has the seal of a court that says Court of Damietta on it. But this is striking because this is the moment in which we talk about an aggressively centralizing state, in which those legal nodes are linked, and there's very good communication between them. So how could the communication have missed something so basic? And again, I have speculations. Maybe the court in Damietta had kind of stopped working, was reinstituted, or maybe these are, I don't know, the first few weeks of the workings of this group of merchants, and they're still kind of figuring out what they should be doing. But it's kind of, to me, this is a moment in which the bureaucracy is kind of more than imperfect, but kind of there's something deficient in the way that it's supposed to be working. So yeah, thanks. I'll leave it here.
Okay. Hello, everyone. I'm also, like Omar, I'm a student of Leslie and have worked on, what I'm working on now is a social history of Al-Azhar, the mosque school from the 14th to the 17th centuries. And so my work really is focused on the development of infrastructure inside the mosque, in particular, a system of lockers, and I'm also very interested in the fraternity system in Al-Azhar, and sort of this space. So walking inside Al-Azhar, what does that space look like? What does the person sort of encounter? And in many ways, gender should be at the heart of this project, right? Because this is predominantly a male space. I mean, I remember Leslie once asked me, I mean, have you found any evidence of women being in the mosque, right? And we know from the work of Marian Katz, right, that women were in mosques, right, throughout the Arab Middle East for centuries. And she kind of looks at the various practices and kind of also talks about social practice vis-a-vis the legalistic discussions about women's places in mosques. And of course, that's important for like modern and contemporary discussions about women in mosques. So I think, I mean, I'm going to start with my work because I have a project that's really conducive to gender analysis, and yet I find it really difficult to use gender as a critical tool here because of the way my sources talk about Azharis. Right, so these scholars or these students who live inside Al-Azhar and occasionally go to court because of conflicts, because in the context of lockers, they're going there to get an appointment to a locker, so a space where they can store their stuff, right? Because they're living inside the mosque, and so they need a place to put their books and to put their writing implements, to put their bedding. Sort of following the pattern of domestic furniture. And the word in Arabic for lockers is khizana. So those are, that's sort of how the texts talk about them. They come up in the context of taqrir and nazar. So appointments, just as appointments are used to assign people a particular endowment-supported office, they're also used to assign people a piece of property, usufruct rights to either a room in a madrasa, a khilwa, so a kind of meditation cell, or a khizana, for example, in Al-Azhar. So one of the things I want to kind of maybe open up with is this idea, the challenge of using these sources. I mean, for me, in Leslie's work, in particular her article in the American Historical Review, where she talks about sort of this intergenerational hierarchy that David, I think, really kind of laid out so well through this genre. I mean, that's a possible opening, right? For talking about, that's a possible opening for talking about the ways in which the sexual openness in the ways that men sort of through the ages are represented. So in thinking more deeply about sexuality, but also like what's male and what's female, right? And how that may change over time. I mean, I'm mindful of Joan Scott's sort of update to her article about how gender has sort of lost its critical edge because we're still reinscribing women and men as kind of natural categories. So I have this project, and you know, I'm in a position where now I can kind of work on the book, and I'd like to explore this lens, but my sources aren't talking about the Azharis in that way. So that's one of the challenges. And what I'd also like to maybe talk about is maybe some of the larger challenges that the intersection of law and gender that scholars face in this intersection in Ottomanist historiography. So, I mean, not to preach to the choir, but I mean, Ronald Jennings is probably the first person who's written in 1975 sort of on women using the Sharia court records. And in that sense, like his work is really contributing to women's studies. But what he kind of does is reflective of the broader trends that sigil-based research sort of, the broader trends in sigil-based research. So the move from sort of positivist readings based on quantifiable methods to, I think, what Leslie does so lovely in Morality Tales, looking at the court as a social arena. And so early sigil-based studies have really followed these shifts closely. So Jennings' work kind of becomes this mold. And what's problematic about it, and other scholars have talked about this, I mean, Iris Agamon has talked about this, is that it's really a response to this notion that the, you know, women in Islamic civilizations, I mean, so across time and space, are servile or secluded in harem. So it's largely a response to that. So in So there are times when it sort of exaggerates the equality of women in law, right? I mean, a great example is when Jennings claims women represented themselves in court and made accusations there. The suits, defenses against suits, and oaths of Muslim women were admitted in exactly the same way as those of Muslim men and were equal to them in every way. Now, not to, I think this scholarship is pioneering and very important. So, but clearly there were gaps in that early literature. I think what Jennings does, and then Heimgerber sort of, who's kind of doing the same exact thing for Bursa. So following that mold, what they're trying to do is really question this universal applicability of this idea of women who are inhibited by the patriarchal family structure that is kind of inscribed by Islamic law, or theories of jurisprudence. And you see a real shift with the work of Judith Tucker. Even in her work, there's a lot of development in terms of her early work on 19th century Egyptian women, and then her later work on sort of marriage and divorce in 17th and 18th century Syria and Palestine. But I think these, the work that's contributing to women's studies and then sort of later gender history is really informed then by the cultural turn, and many people have already kind of talked about that. But Tucker's attention to the legal vocabulary, the cultural constructs in the legal treatises, for example, that she's looking at, or Amira Sanbol's Women, Family, and Divorce Laws, who's writing an edited volume, and a number of contributors are thinking about the legal proceedings that are surrounding these individual cases. So in that way, it's, the cultural turn, I think, is changing the way that Ottomanist historiography is doing women, right? For me, I see Leslie Peirce's Morality Tales as really, and I think for many of us, a monumental work that is doing so many things. I mean, even though it's about 1 year in Aintab, it's also not about 1 year in Aintab, right? It's a social, legal, and micro-historical study of the Aintab Sharia court. And it's not really kind of mundane or representative, but unique because of the coming of the new Qadi. And so what's really interesting is that she sort of starts before he arrives, and then she sort of sees how the cases, sort of the frequency with which people, men and women, are kind of coming to the court after the new Qadi arrives. So in that sense, she's not just interested in the micro picture, but the macro. So it's micro history. It's setting a high bar for micro history. She's turning these three protagonists that I think we all kind of know now, like Ine, Hajia Sabah, and Fatma, into kind of historical actors. And how they're experiencing, so at this micro level, these grand transformations, the Ottomanization of Aintab, its integration into the imperial domains, and how these changes are not just shaping their lives, but how they are shaping these changes. So I think in terms of the challenges ahead, I mean, I've already kind of touched on some of them in my own work, but a number of people have sort of contributed to this idea of approaching archives, like how do we approach the archives anew, contending not only with the general shifts in gender history, but also the important work that's been laid out by a number of anthropologists, for example, so Janice Bodie and Sabah Mahmood, in particular the late Sabah Mahmood, whose work I think has informed all of our scholarship in some way. I mean, in particular, I'm thinking of agency. And so part of our job is or part of what we do, or many of us who work on, and not everyone's working on Sharia court records, but those who are, I think it's really important, especially using a microhistory strategy of interpretation to animate this agency, resurrect this agency. But is that enough, right? I mean, Joan Scott is kind of also critical of this, that part of what she had seen in terms of the critical edge of gender was to not just animate agency and make women historical, for example, men and women historical agents, but to show how they're integral to history. So I guess I want to pose a couple of questions. I mean, can we sort of think about Saba Mahmood's scholarship on agency, and in particular, I mean, her work on the contemporary Moth movement in Egypt, right? So the fact that ideas of agency within by feminist theorists just don't work with that material, right? Like that they place agency as belonging to women, right? And agency should always be in resistance to some sort of patriarchal norm. But what she was finding with her material, with the subjects that she was studying, was they were actually using the traditions and ideals, or the ideals and practices of a tradition that had traditionally subordinated them, and were reinscribing them. So, and I think she raises a lot of questions that are important and should be confronted by Ottomanist historiographies. I mean, by Ottomanist historiographers, Ottoman historians. Like, when we talk about agency, what do we mean, right? Are we? I mean, it comes to bring this back to my own work. I did find, and you know this, Leslie, I did find an example of women who owned a locker in Al-Azhar. And it was sort of in the internal areas of Al-Azhar where men would be, right? And so it kind of begged the question, did they go there? Is there a way to kind of write them into this history, or to see them, or to think more deeply about the men in this period? I mean, there's a series of transactions that the women do in the court related to this locker. I mean, they inherit it from a relative. They decide to split it into 2 units and then to sell it. So there's so a lot of the documents that I'm working with are not just appointments, but they're the buying and selling of usufruct rights to lockers. So I think there are ways. I think Judith Tucker is mindful of the work of Saba Mahmood, and she kind of says that Muslim women, by and large, in Ottoman context, have not embraced an adversarial form of agency, but have participated in the legal system by asserting rights and accepting to fulfill duties and obligations. But that just feels like not enough, right? And I think in many ways, the work of Leslie Peirce is very much about agency, but it's not really a term that comes up, if I remember correctly, in your work. And I think that, this is something, but you do it so well, right? So it's without that language, but and I think a lot of us, I can kind of see that we're, that it's, that you're able to give these 3 women, there are a number of cases that you look at, and in some cases you're just, showing us sort of what you're seeing in the archives. But those particular cases, because you're introducing scenarios, plausibility scenarios in terms of like what may have happened or how did this happen, I think that's incredibly powerful. So we definitely walk away with the sense that these women are agents. But I guess I would like us to think about how we can push this even further. So those are my comments. Thank you. Is it working? Yes. Okay. Oh, perfect.
I've been a backstage crew at some time in my life, so I can locate the right person. So thank you so much for everything. They say if you're a backstage crew, if you make a mistake, nobody forgets you. If you do everything right, nobody remembers you. So. So being here is an amazing source of excitement for you, for me, and probably for you as well. I came to NYU. I fell into NYU 10 years ago as a Fulbright researcher. And I see a lot of familiar faces in the room who basically shaped this project along the way. And it's like yesterday sitting around the table with Omar and Leslie talking about Ottoman studies, bringing that group together. And I was carefully handed to Graduate Center, to Beth Barron. So you're looking at a product of two very amazing scholar, female scholar, feminist scholar. So to connect Irfana's comments on agency, I would like to share with you, Leslie Peirce had a significant impact on my work, but also what is it to be a female academic in today's academic world, and what is it to have a female agency as a female academic? What type of problems and what type of sources of resilience that we need to turn to has been always embedded in our academic conversations. So I would like to thank Leslie for her generosity and for her mentorship along the way, not just about looking at the documents, but looking at the self and build up a self in this world. So I work on history of syphilis in the late Ottoman Empire, and the title of my project is Love in the Time of Syphilis. And today, a little bit different from the roundtable format, because I was supposed to give a paper. I'll tweak it a little bit, and I'll try to walk you through my own story and my own agents, and connect this to the larger questions of how to study gender and sexuality in the late Ottoman Empire, a little bit distancing from the question of law. I start with the image because syphilis is known to be a sneaky, sneaky disease. And when I found this snake image in a medical journal, I was like, yes, I nailed it down. There you go. That's a good beginning for any kind of presentation from now on. But it's also another Ottoman doctor who was a traveling doctor in the mountains of Kastamonu and thereabouts on the Black Sea region. He wrote once, syphilis is a snake in the garden of love and pleasure. It bites and you never know. This disease basically troubled the Ottomans, the Ottoman Empire, all along. And one case has been very significant for me to start my project, and it's one suicide case that a certain Husnu Bey, who has been a lifelong soldier, shot himself to death, and his body was found by the police in his house in the Beyazıt neighborhood. Really, for those who have been to Istanbul, you might know that it's just behind the Sultanahmet area. He left a letter explaining why he killed himself. And he said he killed himself because he was despair, he was very hopeless, because he got syphilis. And he said, he basically detailed the story saying that he never goes to bad places, such places, and he got syphilis from a certain Ahmet Efendi who was serving water, who was in charge of the cleaning of the office that he was working at in the logistics department of the army stationed at Istanbul. And my first reaction was, you're such a liar, that this cannot be true, that you actually got syphilis from a certain Ahmed who was suffering from syphilis as well. And I had no idea that and it could be transmitted through non-venereal forms. But this didn't end there, and he basically continued saying that it was not only this, but the doctor maldiagnosed his disease. Doctor basically thought that it was a tooth infection, and he sent him back home with certain medicines. And when the disease switched to the third stage, only then he knew that it was syphilis. So he was also really angry and upset with the doctor who couldn't figure out what the disease was all about. And now he's hopeless that he cannot really live with that. And he killed himself. And at the end, he said, Elveda, au revoir, goodbye, in a very, very poetic way. And he said, I have 3 kids and my wife crying around my grave who are probably also suffering from the disease. Please help them. I want help from the government. So this particular piece really shaped the entire project in the sense that I started asking myself, what is it to be Hüsnü Bey in the late 19th century Istanbul as a middle-class man, and having the courage or desperation to kill himself because of a disease that hasn't been figured out yet? And what is it to be Hüsnü Bey as an army member? What is it to be a Hüsnü Bey as a father? What is it to be a syphilitic in the late Ottoman Empire? How did he know so much about the nature of the disease? Where did he get the information? But also, what was syphilis in the late Ottoman Empire, and the ways in which that it basically shaped that type of like social relationships and as self-destruction. So syphilis was not there. So syphilis was there since the 16th century. And it actually became a particular public health concern starting from 1860s. There's this one particular dispatch of the head of the health department, Marco Pasha, who's also a sort of source of joke in many. It became like an comic figure later in Turkish history. But Marco Pasha basically sent this dispatch to all the provinces asking, how many syphilitics do you have? To the province, to governors. And this was basically that I consider as the very beginning of the concern, the emergence of the concern as a public health concern in the late Ottoman Empire. And the question basically plagued me, like, why is it 1860s? What was it happening in 1860s in the Ottoman Empire? And there were a lot of things happening. There was a post-Crimean War and a very big scale of mobilization of population through the recruitment of the soldiers for the Crimean War, through the infrastructure projects in the Ottoman Empire, and through the immigration and the mobilization of the immigrants from the Caucasus and the Balkans. Was basically created this like very, very mobile moment, almost like a movable empire, the way that Rashad Kasaba refers to it. So that's, a lot of people are moving, but especially men are on the move. But that wasn't the only reason why in 1860s, syphilis became a public health concern. And it was also the professionalization of medicine in the Ottoman Empire. And this is the building that I was born, by the way. This is the professionalization of medicine in the sense that for the first time in 1860s, the Ottoman bureaucrats considered centralizing, registering, licensing physical, the medical practice. And there is no Ottoman exceptionalism here. This is basically a global phenomenon at the time, happening everywhere in the world. And around the same time, to connect to Hassan's comments this morning, that the simultaneity, that the syncing with the rest of the world in terms of this one particular area. And this centralization and licensing doctors' practices and the pharmaceutical practice, basically, which I offer that, is kind of a sign of and making of a biopolitical empire, where the bodies of the people, and this basically connects to Alan's and Christine's article to think about the imperial turn and to think about what type of an empire Ottoman Empire was. It's about the whole emphasis on like where medicine falls into, not just like as an auxiliary power to rule, actually the actual power, the power that carried by the Ottomans to internally colonize its peripheries, its provinces, to change the ways in which how people think about their bodies, their health, their individual acts, the ways in which they eat, they clean themselves, and create this like embed and cultivate the sense of biopolitical individuals in the course of the 19th century. And indeed, if you see these pictures, one of them is a hospital opening in Tripoli, another one is in a smallpox vaccine by Miralay Hüseyin Remzi, and the other one is in an Rinderpest vaccination attempt. These are like images that we are very used to see British going to India, French going to North Africa. And these images were very much like popularly circulated in all of the mainstream newspapers and illustrated journals to basically tell about how medicine is very at the center of the ruling mechanism, the ruling mentality. It's not an auxiliary power, but it's actually the power itself. So when it comes to syphilis, this particular character, Dr. Zahapullo, with the Marco Pashas I mentioned in the 1860s, when the syphilis became like a public health concern, was sent to Kastamonu province and to do an examination in the whole region with the accompany of the gendarme and police force, because people didn't allow doctors to enter their homes for such an examination. And he sent this particular report about to tell what is going on in this particular place, especially in Bolu, in terms of the syphilis. And 80% of the entire Bolu population and 60% of the entire Kastamonu province population were actually suffering from syphilis as early as 1865. What does that mean? And he goes on to explain that a lot of the people who were suffering from syphilis were babies, were infants who had the congenital syphilis, or the men who were in this second stage, which is basically the most contagious stage. And this is the third stage. This is a much later image that I can explain later, but this is basically what happens to you if you're in the third stage. And not every metabolism actually experiences syphilis equally. So it's very difficult to actually say who is in the what stage. But what he said was really interesting. While the global historiography of syphilis basically makes an emphasis on prostitutes and prostitutes' bodies, Zahapullo said that men were the vectors of the disease. Men were mobile. They were going everywhere. They were going to the prostitutes. They were coming back home, and they were basically contaminating their wives, their kids, whoever they're sharing the same habitats, they're basically contaminating everybody. The concern is here an able-bodied man to be conscripted into the army. So his question is, the reason for the very desire for this examination, and this report is coming from a very, very practical point of view, but then pictures us like what is gender and the ways in which how gender has been negotiated in 1860s. And he basically says that as long as they don't have visible wounds on their body, they can be conscripted very easily. And he also suggested something else. He said that we're giving mürür tezkeresi, we're giving the domestic passports to those who are traveling from provinces into big cities, especially to Istanbul. So here's what I'm suggesting, that from now on, we should give them a syphilis treatment log, a kind of like a medical identity card, where they will say that what is the status of their health, and especially if they ever had syphilis. So actually, as a doctor, this doctor's report, Zahapullo's report, reflecting a particular gendered moment. He's basically suggesting licensing working class men traveling here and there, the way that they licensed prostitutes. So the syphilis, in a way, became this very catalyzer in the ways in which to reorganize and imagine what is a man, what is a woman, and who is a syphilitic man, and who is a syphilitic woman. In that sense, there is this new archetype of poor, innocent women who don't know anything, but they are very open to the violation of their right to life by their husbands. And there is this unscrupulous man who are basically contaminated by their husband, like emerged. All the syphilis doctors, in their very specialized book on medicine, or in the mainstream newspapers, in the pieces that they are writing for everyday propaganda, public health propaganda, they basically brought up and repeated this new archetype of unscrupulous man who needs to be disciplined, man who needs to be controlled. On the other hand, women who needs to be protected. So this is a moment, especially, I'm basically talking about now 1880s, 1890s, is the moment when the Ottoman bureaucrats start investing in the women's health institutions and women's health clinics and personnel and publications and propaganda. Highland Haseki Hospital in Istanbul had been this very, very important model for that. But it wasn't limited to this. So there is this very diverse, targeted audience to be able to first teach them what is syphilis, second, to teach them how do you protect yourself, and third, to basically moralize them as you're teaching them, right? And there is this one particular genre that emerged, and I think that engages with David's presentation very nicely, that this secrecy, where people, syphilis, one thing about syphilis is that it doesn't kill immediately and you're not bedridden. It's very easy to hide it. And there is this whole secrecy is the main enemy of all these state policies. And this new medical advice literature, a public health propaganda genre emerged. But emerged again, referring back to Hassan, emerged again in a conversation with and global literature emerging, especially French and British literature emerging on the same topic. And on the left-hand side, you see Auguste Debaille's very famous book, Hygiène de Mariage, and which was, by the time, a very important gynecologist in the Ottoman Empire, Bessim Amar, translated it in late 1880s and early 1890s. Auguste Debaille made his 173rd edition in Paris already. So it's basically these books are not written for experts, but basically targeting middle-class men, middle-class women, and teaching them about hygiene de mariage, basically how do you get married, what is your body, how the sexual intercourse happens, what is the source of desire, and how do men and men treat properly. So these two, they're not, I mean, what Bessim Amar did was not a direct translation. So this is, I think, really engaging with what David is telling us in the former panel. It is not a direct translation, it's a compilation. Bessim Amar took Auguste Debaille's book and reimagined the order of the book. He basically changed the order of the topics. He changed the vocabulary in it. And he actually, at some point, negated what Auguste Debaille said and adapted it into the sensibilities of the Ottoman society. So this goes back to one particular thing that Ellen and Kristen write in the Imperial Turn article, that for a long time we were all about the Ottoman exceptionalism and we kept writing about how Ottomans were different. And then now with the Imperial Turn, there's this whole sameness. There's a try to be able to fit Ottoman Empire and the ways in which Ottomans acted in the late 19th century into this discourse of like they were a part of the globe, but how do we find the balance between this difference and sameness? And I think this really can be an interesting example in the sense that this is about this one particular, how do you intervene, whatever that's simultaneously happening and interpreted it. And Bessim Amar did it really interestingly. And I think this is one of the examples how he did it interestingly. Auguste Debaille wrote a book, but Bessim Amar included images. And those images, that the kind of images that by medicalizing sex and sex talk, by medicalizing the very content of the conversation about sexuality, it basically desexualizing love, basically separating the talk about desire from and pleasure from the definition of love. He basically was able to bring those images into a book that has been targeting a general audience. And this is where also the Ottoman sensibilities are recreated against the Victorian understanding of what is a body, what is a sexuality, what is sexuality. And not only that, he also played with the vocabulary. He didn't take the French vocabulary that is embedded in the French language, like the sexual intercourse, sexual impulses, and arousal, so on and so forth. But what he did really interestingly, Bessim Amar referred to the Bahname as a very older Kama Sutra tradition, and he brought this Shahvati Jima and Arzuyu Bahi, and he basically blended that older, like made it like a genealogy of sex talk into the new medical textbooks. And this is basically where, and according to that, according to Bessim Amar, love and desire, which was also the part of the book that Auguste Debaille did not include, the source of desire is definitely medically, and the target of love is reproduction. As long as the sexual intercourse is geared towards the reproduction, it's real love. So excessive love and lack of love actually are pathologies. They are disease. They are disease that needs to be treated. And if normative love and heteronormative love is the true love, but reproduction is necessary. That's why later Bessim Amar largely wrote about like infertility and how infertility and shouldn't be ashamed of. So I started with a suicide note. I would like to end with a suicide note. And this is really sad. This is sad. This is Nuri Efendi's suicide. So Nuri Efendi was a military medical school student, and he basically commits suicide because he was also despair. He was despair not because of syphilis, but because of love. He was in love with another student at the military medical school, and by basically going to the pharmacy right across the school and paying 2 kurush, I translated 2 penny, and he got arsenic and he killed himself, and he left a consolation letter to his lover. So this letter is by Besim Ömer, but this is not the Besim Ömer, the doctor. This Besim Ömer is the consultant to Sultan, another Besim Ömer who is really close to Sultan, who got the news that a military school student killed himself because of love. He left a note saying that, I'm in love. It's an unrequited love. It's an impossible love. I can't go on. I have to kill. He basically killed himself. So what about this particular character, Besim Ömer said that, never dare to say that he killed himself because of love. You have to explain to this particular matter to his family in Baghdad, who are very, very affluent family, coming from a very affluent family. And don't dare to tell the students that he actually killed himself because of love. He killed himself only because he has an illeti dimaghiye, which is basically neurological disease. So one cannot, I mean, I don't know whether this particular Besim Ömer was reading the Dr. Besim Ömer at the time, but they were definitely, there is another there is another synchronization, and there is another kind of simultaneity between the political mind, political mentality, and the medical mentality that overlap, defining same-sex desire and any affective, any emotional response to that as a pathology. So I will end here, basically with this particular picture, and sorry to say it's a sad story. Syphilis story continued. Syphilis story continued. It was very immune to revolutions. It was immune to political regimes. It was immune to wars. So as much as the Turkish Republic inherited the deaths of the Ottoman Empire, it also inherited the syphilis, and also the doctors who were making decisions about syphilis. So that inheritance was completed, and it was the segment of Europe turned into Turkish Republic at some point. So thank you so much for bearing with me and your patience. Thank you.
So we have 30 minutes for questions, and we'll do the same thing with the mic that we did in the previous panels for recording purposes. So the floor is open. And if not, I'll just ask. Yeah.
He needs a mic.
Yeah, so.
I have a question to Seçil. So this, you started out with this suicide note and end up with that. And basically, you also talk about, bodies as contested space, contested, spaces, I don't know, between, people and the state, right?
Mm-hmm.
Do you see suicide as a part of that, part of that trend, of, claiming the ownership of your body, your life, by ending it, deciding to end it?
Mm-hmm. That's a very good question. I don't particularly work on suicide, but I came across almost half a dozen suicide notes in the context of syphilis. And there are studies, like Nazan Maksudian has one work on the implication of suicide in early Republican Turkey. I think my response can go, like, there is a crisis of gender and crisis of sexual regimes, the ways in which people, like this whole like identity markers. I think at the late 19th century, especially when I look at the books like Aşk-ı Marazi. They're also, the self-help books are not just about making up a new and beautiful family, but it's also about how to be sane. And there are medical school professors wrote these books for general audience, a very, very, very informed, very multi-layered books for general audience about love disease. And this, I think, this basically opens it, and I'm assuming that it's mostly men who are reading these books. They're basically talking to a male audience. And I think this is definitely a direct link about the crisis of masculinity, along with the crisis of collapse of the empire, the crisis of modernity. And I mean, all these are, I think, going hand in hand. And the need for such books like Aşk-ı Marazi tells me that then there's a particular a trend to self-destruction and negotiating life and death in that context, I believe. So I think I can only assume, but this definitely backs in more research and engagement with the affect theory that, that Ottoman historians don't do much. But I think this whole question of life, that who's the sovereign is definitely connecting to that particular type of reading and genre, if we do. Yeah, thank you. I think that's the question.
I do not know how it is now, but as recent as 1973, when I got married, the two Turkish citizens had to go to the registry and provide a document that their family members of her ancestor or his ancestors were not affected by syphilis. When I forgot what we say in Turkish, but you had to prepare, present a paper. Yeah. It was very specific for syphilis. Mm-hmm. I mean, I'm of course of an earlier generation. I don't know whether they still require it. It was not prohibiting the marriage, mm-hmm. but it was informing the parties that your great-grandfather might have had syphilis. Fortunately, I didn't have any, so there was no problem, but I don't know whether they still ask it.
First of all, I'm sorry for your experience that you had to go through.
No, it was easy, but...
Right. Well, the Zahapoulou, that particular doctor, as early as 1865, he wanted, that was another thing that he suggested. And there were a lot of pushback from the people, from the local people, but they still try to do it. So if someone wants to get married, especially in the Kastamonu region and other regions that are basically stamped as syphilitic regions, they had to go to the imam and first the local physician, and with the report of the local physician, they had to take their report to the imam or muhtar for their nikah, for their marriage. But then there were a lot of pushbacks, and also there weren't enough doctors, especially around 1890s. Abdul Hamid II thought that all these physicians, especially civilian physicians who were educated in Istanbul and became revolutionaries, became the agents of revolution. So he basically stopped sending doctors into the peripheries to prevent any revolutionary spark or movement. So it's basically their desires of the state and their realities, and that's stuck between. But then Turkish Republic was more efficient in taking care of that, I think.
But in our case, it wasn't really taking care of it. They would know if my great-great-grandfather, mm-hmm. I don't know how far back they went, had, or I don't know whether they wrote the female ancestors also, they would provide that, in addition to having a checkup and all sorts of things. But they would, I mean, the Ottomans really registered all these things in the Nüfus İdaresi.
This is related.
Okay.
This is a follow-up question. Jane Burbank, Russian history, but right now I'm going to follow up as American citizen getting married twice, actually, and so in the United States, at least in the states where I got married, you had to you had to demonstrate that you didn't have a venereal disease. But the interesting thing was there was nothing about ancestors. It was simply about the presence or absence of a venereal disease. But this brings up for me, if I can, a question, and that is, and it's about a word that's been bothering me today. Most of the words today I've loved, but the wonderful ones about Leslie. But one word that several people have used in their talks is synchronicity. And I hope you'll take this as a comment coming from a historian of Russia. And as those of you who've worked with me know, we feel that the Russian Empire and the Ottoman Empire have many, or the history of the Russian Empire and history of the Ottoman Empire have many problems in common. Mm-hmm. And one of them, of course, was a complex about relationships with the so-called West. So what's bothering me is that in a number of the talks, I've heard this word, synchronicity, as if it's a puzzle. And also, it is not spatially very well defined. Mm-hmm. So we had a 17th century example where the spatial definition might have been the surrounding big powers, but it was primarily European plus that big elephant in the room, Russia. And then I'm hearing in the 19th century papers, again, the sense, what a puzzle, synchronicity. But it isn't really, what I'm worried about is that this is another way of getting around an old problem, as I see it, in both Russian and Ottoman history, and that is dependence on the West or communication with the West, something like this. Mm-hmm. But what I'm seeing from the papers and the evidence that you're dealing with is that people have specific vectors, retranslations, transformations, Ottoman way of doing things. And what I'm asking about is, don't we have a better word? Don't you really need to unpack the notion of synchronicity or maybe throw it out?
So there is a question in the back first.
Does anyone want to respond?
Or respond?
No, I didn't use the word.
You
so
didn't.
Yeah.
The others in the audience.
No, absolutely. I'll take up that challenge. I think I used the word first for the first time to engage with what we had this conversation today. But I think what I usually don't resort, and I use the word compilation rather than translation, and the intervention into the text, and to be able to create this sort of like Ottoman sensibilities, and to be able to talk about what is Ottoman about that story. Like, Ottomans talked about sex, and I think that is basically by medicalizing it, especially doctors took up that challenge, and by separating what pleasure meant and what health meant, and created this new vocabulary of sexuality in that particular context. But I think there is this whole, like, I want to say, I mean, at least the group that I'm working with, they're doctors. And there is this whole expertise exchange and intimacy. Like, I think that is the vocabulary, that writing letters to each other when they find something, being very zealous, that they have this, like, they have a very, very naive optimism, not a cruel optimism, in the sense that Berlan writes that they actually see that whatever they're intervening is like flourishing and it's not collapsing. So I think that's kind of like the ways in which I think about sinking, but yeah, I'll definitely keep thinking about it. Thank you.
Okay, David Sayers from the University of Vienna. I just wanted to thank you, Sichil, for this very inspiring talk, and in the spirit of sort of deepening the conversation between the sources from the realm of fiction and the sources from the realm of medicine, rather than posing a direct question, I just wanted to unpack a little bit more the connections that you were pointing out. Namely, now I understand better why you asked your question about the disciplining of men that you asked earlier, and it sort of points to a blind spot in what I was talking about, but I can talk about it a little bit more now. namely, I said that you have in these late Ottoman Tiflis stories where the figure of the girl is introduced, you have the main dilemma located in this new character type of the girl. Whereas I said, okay, the adaptation of this Ottoman figure of the Levant to stand for the man, the sort of Western romantic pursuer, it was more seamless. But there were problems there as well, and those are problems that I feel your medical sources are kind of trying to address in a way, because the Levant is this is not just a Romeo who falls in love with his beloved and then is going to marry her and then is just going to have a happily ever after with this. The Levant is not suitable for that kind of romantic story. The Levant is a sort of pansexual sexual aggressor who is sexually dangerous for society, but at the same time heroic, because he has this sort of virile, unbridled masculinity that transforms into, for instance, heroic deeds on the battlefield, right? The people that you were talking about, the people mobilized for these wars, et cetera, were likely to view themselves in light of such stereotypes. Like the Levant stereotype was a dangerous, but at the same time heroic stereotype. And when the Levant did get married, that didn't mean that his sexual career was from then on limited to his wife, right? I mean, there were many options open to him. So it was really interesting for me to see how your discourse, like the medical discourse that you're addressing, it just basically fills in a gap in the stuff that my stories talk about, because the stories end with the marriage, but the syphilis discourse that tries to tame that male sexuality after marriage, right, or sort of it tries to tame it vis-a-vis marriage, like just pointing out that, okay, marriage means that the sexuality needs to be tamed before or after, or just in general. It just fills in that gap and tries to tame the Levant stereotype, tries to give the Levant stereotype a reason to both be itself and not be itself. So the Levant finds himself in a similar dilemma to the girl. The Levant finds himself in a dilemma where he's supposed to be this sort of aggressive, virile young male, but at the same time he's supposed to curtail his sexuality. So from that springs a dilemma that is actually not that dissimilar to the dilemma that the girl is facing, and I find that fascinating. Thanks.
Omar, the Domyat's court issue. So I'd love to just invite you to say a bit more about that. Could, you interpret it one way, but there are probably other ways of interpreting it, and so, I have some thoughts, but I would love to hear if you have other ideas as to how we might think about the, stated non-understanding that there is a court in Domyat.
So one thing, there is a network ultimately of 4 merchant courts in Egypt, and they are not created at the same time. The initial ones, 1844-45, are in Alexandria and Cairo, and those are the central ones. And then in 56, there is one created in Domyat. And then a little later, I think in the 60s, I can't remember the date now, there's one in Asyut. In seeing the operation of those courts, even the central one, the Cairo one, which I looked at, there were times when the court, especially in the first 2 decades or so, the 40s and the 50s, 1840s and 1850s, there were times when the court seemed to be functioning regularly. It meets on regular days during the week, and it sees, on average, a certain number of cases. And then there would be days, sometimes several consecutive days in the middle, in which nothing is happening. And there would be an entry marking the day, because the court is supposed to meet on this day, and it would say, court did not meet and did not hear cases. And it's not clear why. Did the people presiding over the court just not show up? Did they show up but no one came with a case like for them to hear, and so on? So there is already a sense, there is something interesting about creating, in my mind, these kind of legal forums. And you create them because there's going to be a demand for them. They're going to perform a function. But then it seems as if, for reasons that I cannot explain fully or could only speculate about, where it seems that this kind of bureaucratic space had been created, but it's almost like preceding or is happening at a faster speed than there's actually demand for this forum. And so because of this, I assume that maybe in the other towns, because they are more provincial, but also because they are, in terms of the archive, they haven't been cataloged, or when I was there, they were not cataloged yet. You could see them on the catalog, but you couldn't see the registers. Is that maybe this was happening even more, or kind of more frequently? So this is one thing. And then the other thing that I had in mind when I saw this is that it's very common, not in relation maybe to legal forums or to bureaucracies, modern bureaucracies, but especially in relation to the economic aspect of this and the study of markets. There's always the issue which economists and economic historians grapple with, which is the issue of whether there is perfect information or not. And so, but the bureaucracy is supposed to, especially in the second half of the 19th century in Egypt, which is like the model centralizing state in the Middle East and in the Ottoman realm, is that the bureaucracy is about circulating information, partly. It's not that the information kind of circulates to support its functioning, but it is supposed to be circulating the information. So the fact that the information is not circulating perfectly is something that I find very puzzling. And I can imagine part nodes within this kind of network that we call the bureaucracy becoming dormant, or there's no use for them, and so they slow down, and then they're forgotten for a bit, and then they're reactivated. But those are just, I don't know, these are kind of just thoughts.
I can push you further on this point.
Please.
And it's a question of, first, how can we, or the ability of history as a profession to cope with messiness in the narratives we generate. And I would, you can think about, I'm surprised that people actually know that the bureaucracy actually functions. Mm-hmm. I mean, to me, the mess seems like the natural state, and that every now and then they get it right. And the thing is, because like the archives we work with tend to generate, and they're obsessed with a false coherence, we get those things only when there is a cataloging mistake or when you have these moments. But if you think about this as the normal state rather than the exception, how would you read your story if this irregularity is actually much more regular?
So, and I see what you're saying. There's something about kind of taking this to its conclusion, which would make the accumulation of knowledge almost impossible. So if there's absolutely no, or not absolutely, I mean, I'm kind of exaggerating, but if the irregularity is the norm, then what would this leave us with other than studying isolated cases that we cannot kind of...
Oh, no, I mean, I think that the issue is that there are expectations, there are pretensions,
right. Okay.
And along these pretensions, there are, endless numbers of, an endless number of failures that,
right.
you may interpret in different ways.
Right. Okay, that's a fair point.
And we have time for two more questions. So first, there's Leslie.
I have a question for Omar and Irfana, and it's a messy question. I'm not quite sure how I want to frame it, but we don't work in a vacuum. I mean, you've got undergraduates. Soon you'll have graduate students. You're formulating your own work. What are you going to emphasize? What vocabulary are you using? And I guess I just wanted to ask you sort of what's it like to be teaching in your generation with your students? Because I'm a very different generation. And you can speak about law, gender, what you want. That's a very messy question. I'm really sorry, but I mean, Irfana, you laid out some of the questions, some of the constraints, ways in which people are readdressing what happened, thinking 30 years ago. I mean, what's it like being you now and writing and addressing a book? And do your students play any role in shaping the way you're thinking? I'm asking about students, partly. Sorry.
mean, they definitely play a role. I mean, sorry. So one of the challenges I have is that, so I graduated from NYU in 2014 from the joint program in History and Middle Eastern and Islamic Studies, and I went in the job market, and I ended up with a tenure track job in a religion department teaching Islam and other religious traditions, and so so now that's what I do, and it's like in some ways like I teach things that I wasn't necessarily trained to do, and I think that that's also the nature of the beast. But in those moments when I do get to teach sort of classes focused on Middle Eastern and Ottoman history, or even gender and sexuality in Islam, I mean, I kind of name it so it fits in the department, but I name the course in that way. But I think with the students, I'm really challenged because they're experts at gender and sexuality, and I feel like I'm just trying to catch up. And they can tell you about the spectrum of gender and sexuality in ways that I think I just have catching up to do. I mean, the small example of LGBTQ, just it's ever changing, and they are so plugged into that. And so and this is just on this particular class. So what I found really worked was getting them to kind of think about Muslim societies through case studies. So, and I presented my own material. I mean, there's fascinating work on Iran and sort of the surgeries, right? Sex change surgeries. So that was something that I brought in, and I mean, they were super fascinated, and then I gave them a chance to kind of work on their own projects. So I had one student who very openly sort of talks about how he came out gay in Seattle, and then was immediately rejected by the evangelical community that he was a part of. And so, and he, is in his 4th year now, and so we've all seen his kind of growth. And I just read his memoir for our, it's part of like the department, it's requirements for the major. And sort of watching him sort of tease that out and how it affected and impacted his intellectual growth. And he was in that class, and I remember him telling me how he just started Googling sort of gay in the Middle East or, Muslim societies, and found out that Pakistan comes up like as, the first or second search result is. And so he started working on that, sort of the experience of being gay in Pakistan. And so I'm just kind of trying to catch up, and I've heard you talk about your students in similar ways, that they challenge you and push you in ways that are, just push you to think in ways that you may not have thought about. And I'm certainly experiencing that from my perspective, where I am.
So I'm like Irfana, I'm also lucky. I teach in a place where I never have to be in kind of speaking to more than 25 people at a time, and I know every one of them by kind of a couple of weeks or so. And I think that this relieves me of a particular kind of pressure where I need to perform authority in a particular way. And so I can be, and I find myself gravitating towards being very transparent and kind of elemental almost when it comes to how this knowledge that we're talking about was put together. And in doing so, I feel, and because of, and I've experienced this, it's not only a feeling, but in doing this, I'm discovering in this dynamic what I know and what I don't know, or what I'm sure of and what I'm not sure of. But I also am faced by questions of, because those are undergraduates specifically, that are those kind of surprising questions that come from a first encounter of an awareness of methodology, basically. That it's not the content of what we're talking about that is open to questioning, but it's how this was put together in the first place. This kind of, back to Guy, what you were saying, how did we, to what extent are we forcing a sense of order and regularity over what we're saying. And I feel that this is, to me, the kind of the feeling or the thought that I have constantly in teaching is that this is, in these moments of discovering gaps, doubting myself, thinking, oh, this is not, I present this with a certain level of certainty, but then I even, like to myself, I can't really justify the certainty. That I feel that the intellectual process is sharpened. And of course there are many moments in which students raise points that are excellent and things I haven't thought about. But because of the small scale and because of the particular what I think is this kind of not feeling a necessity or a need to perform authority, that I'm also able to easily admit, oh, I don't know this, and the training that we've received, thanks to you and to others in this room, is also about knowing when to say I don't know and when to say we don't know as part of the scholarly community, because no one knows yet. So yeah, I mean that's as much of an answer as I can give.
And we are out of time. Thank you all. And Leslie, you would like, or should we take a break? 10 minutes break? No? Okay.
We shouldn't take a break.
Okay, no break.
Hi, thank you all for coming. This is amazing that this is ending on time. This is great, and I thank you all for your efficiency. But before anyone leaves, I just ask you to just remain seated for a moment. Leslie, we have a special tribute. Somebody wanted to send you a message, so I asked you to put your attention to the board, to the projector. Can you turn off the light? Yeah, thank you.
Hello everybody and good evening from Auckland, New Zealand. I hope you all had a wonderful day today, but just before you move on to the party, I was asked to say a few words. I would like to thank everybody, all the people who took part in this conference. We really appreciate all the time and effort that you've put into it. I want to thank the members of the organizing committee, Guy, Ellen, Tara, and James. A special thanks should go to Karen from the history department. Karen labored on all administrative and logistical aspects of the conference and had to contend with receiving 1,000 emails from me daily, usually exactly at the time when I was starting my day and she was getting ready to go home. But the biggest thanks to the person who really made this event possible should go to Leslie. We all owe her so much, and this conference was just our small way of showing that. Leslie was a teacher and mentor to many people, and today's conference, today's program shows her influence on the field of Ottoman history, from the 15th century to the 19th century, from Egypt to Greece, from the logistical reality of print to the tantalizing world of sexually transmitted diseases. We all made our first steps in this profession with Leslie's invaluable guidance. Leslie, I wish I could be there today to share my own research on Ottoman poets in Bosnia. But more than that, I wish I could be there to tell you in person just how indebted I am to you. You have taught me so much. The Imperial Harem was the first Ottoman history book that I have read cover to cover as an undergraduate student in Tel Aviv. I have learned so much from you. You have taught me how to be a scholar, and you showed me what serious research looks like. I have learned a lot from you, and I hope that when I have students of my own, I can do the same for them. I wish you all the best for the rest of the evening, and I hope to see you all in person before too long.
Leslie, that's the face I wanted to see, that Eyelet wanted to make sure she was a part of this evening. And I will let her know, she will see your reaction. And it's truly heartfelt. So I want everyone to just give yourselves a round of applause. The next voice you will hear will be the closing remarks from our honoree. Leslie, please come up.
Oh, okay. I think I'd know by now. Unlike many of the people you've listened to today, I still have to have notes. After 30 years of all of this, I still have to have my notes here, so I don't forget anything. I think this is one of the very best days of my life. And I might mention just two other best days of my life. I think the one I want to mention is when I was accepted into the Peace Corps. And I wouldn't have this career if I hadn't been. And thank God the Moroccans, well, I wanted to go to Morocco, and the Moroccans decided they didn't want any women, but Turkey was fine with that. So, yeah. Second day that I want to mention is becoming a mother, and I just have to say my son is here, and I'm just thrilled. And, yeah, I mean, and I do want to say something very briefly. At the age of 11, he came with me to do my dissertation research, and he's kind of been stuck with the Ottomans forever. And in my last book, 2 chapters, I had emergency conversations with him, and one was the day before the manuscript went in. I had to talk to him. So, you know, he's kind of like an Ottomanist, too. I wanted to say that. Okay, these are random remarks. I want to say, and I think with Sitchell's talk, you understood that maybe if you're not an academic, that I'm only one of the people who worked with all of the people you heard from today. In some cases, I might be the principal advisor, but in 2 cases here, I was the outside member of a committee. That means that when you're examined in your own university, you need somebody from some other university to kind of validate that the proceedings are going okay. But then you stay in touch with those people, and they become part of the people you want to be in touch with. This whole process, and it's been so exciting all year long. It's been more than a year. Guy, where are you? I mean, it's been more than a year, I think, that this has been under discussion, right? And I'm sorry? I mean, it's just been so exciting, and this day has actually come, and now it's going to be over. But we have the video, which is really wonderful. This has made me think about my own dissertation advisor, whom I occasionally think about from time to time, but I started really thinking about this. And I think just a couple of things I wanted to say about that. When I defended, and I defended at the same day as Mugege Cech, those of you who know her, a sociologist at the University of Michigan, you know, we had a party, and I tried to thank him. And he said, you know, I tried to thank my advisor. And he basically said, if I did anything right, you do it. And I was thanking him partly and specifically for writing all of those recommendation letters. And so I really tried hard to be a good person writing recommendation letters. And then this is another story about him, and it's kind of unrelated. He was a professor in England first before he came to Princeton. And he happened to have a student, a Ugandan student, and he went to Uganda and he visited. She was teaching at Kampala University, and he went and she invited him into one of her classes, and she said to him, "Here are your academic grandchildren." Wow, a whole class of academic grandchildren, and this. It's just so exciting that the people you've heard from today have their own students, and their students are going to have their students. And I just love this sort of chain of transmission. And when I was thinking about this, I thought the term, and you all can jump in, silsila, is so important in Islamic studies. Silsila can mean a chain, but it can also mean a chain of transmission. Hassan can tell us about silsilas and Sufi groups. And we are part of a silsila, and now, you know, there are more chains following me, because you're all training your own students, and you will be. So, I mean, it's just fascinating to me that I went back to my own past, and I just feel part of a very long process here. I have just come to the thank yous. I want to thank all of the same people. I'll just start with the folks and organizations, and Katie is here, she can represent the Provost's office, I mean, who contributed to this. So the financial contributions. The history department, I have to thank so much for backing this up. Contributions from the Middle East and Islamic Studies department. Where is Karen? No, I'm looking for Karen. Oh, Marion is here. Hi, Marion. Yes, Katie, Marion, who is the chair of the Middle East and Islamic Studies. Karen? I'm here. I mean, Karen, I just don't, without you, this wouldn't have happened. It wouldn't have happened without you. I mean, thank you so much. Thank you so much. And just thank you, all of the participants who came all this way, some of you from very, very far away. So I'm so happy, and I'm just happy. I'm going to stop talking here. So thank you all.
Okay, that concludes this wonderful conference. I'm going to ask that everyone take part in the reception. Lots of food and spirits outside on the patio. There will be an opportunity if others want to give a toast to Leslie outside. But thank you all again for coming, those that have come near and far. I wish you safe travels back. And thank you and good night.